Great, great. Thanks, lady. Welcome, everybody, and thanks to Lady. She's our executive administrator with the Executive Service Corps, and she did a marvelous job of changing my PowerPoint to something beautiful. I'd sent her original slide deck, and it didn't look anything like what you're going to see, and you could thank her for that. I'd rather have human interaction on this, but I guess it's turned out to be a virtual world, so we're going to have to do it virtually today. But I encourage you, if you have a question, to put it in the chat or ask me questions as we go along. Make it more of a conversation. Let me start with putting it on the. Well, the first thing you need to understand about, maybe you've gone to some leadership development conferences, maybe you've taken a course, maybe you've read some books. But as Einstein said, all true learning is experience. Everything else is just information. So I see most of you probably learned to ride a bicycle. You learn to swim, you learn how to type, all kinds of things that you do. And did you read a manual on how to do it? Maybe you had a coach, but the only way you learn how to do anything is actually experiencing doing it. When you're a child and you touch the hot pot on the stove, you realize that it's hot, and that's how you learn about it. So as an aspiring leader, you have to really focus on the experience. I'm going to give you some information today, some ideas, some results of things I've learned over the years that maybe you can try out and experiment with. And hopefully it'll have a positive effect for you. I hope so. A couple of examples, and I'll be telling you a lot of stories today, and just out of my own life and experience about what reinforces hopefully the points. One of my first jobs was at the Shell refinery in Martinez, California, and we were starting up a large refinery expansion at the time. And I was in the control room one night, and the major pump to the hydrocracker had gone down, and nobody knew why. And so, as one of the engineers in the control room, I rushed out to the pump and waited for the maintenance people, because I could probably calculate the pressure requirement for the pump, but I didn't know how to fix the pump. And so the people who had the experience doing it fixed it. I could have been the smart graduate chemical engineer and try to direct them, but I didn't do that. I listened and observed and was grateful for the work that they do. But they knew how to do it because they experienced it. Second brief story is about my wife, after her first child, had a gallbladder problem. And the OBGYN was just out of medical school, basically, and we finally discovered that she'd had a gallbladder problem. So they operated on her, and they decided, well, my wife decided, why don't you take my appendix out while you're in there? And of course, they opened her up. They didn't do laparoscopic surgeries then. They opened her up, and they realized her gallbladder wasn't quite in the place the anatomy book said it should be. And it was positioned in such a way that they couldn't take out the appendix. And of course, the surgeon, he was the assistant, he was the OBGYN, he was quite surprised. But if you have somebody do your heart surgery or any surgery, you don't want somebody to do it for the first time. You want somebody that did it multiple times. And so experience is the only thing that gives you that wisdom to do it. And it's kind of the same in leadership. You have to, your best teacher really should be your last mistake. So it's really saying that knowledge of leadership is not too effective. You can go to the development seminars, you can read the books, but as it says here, it's not learning to read music, it's making music. So I can't really teach you leadership. You can only learn through better experience, or any experience really. You are the teacher. So if you keep that in mind, you'll take chances, you'll take risks. Most people don't take risks because they feel failure. But failure is the best way to actually increase your learning. And there's a lot of leadership myths. I've listed a few of them. Leaders are born, not made. Well, you can describe it as the lucky sperm theory, but that's really not true at all. You don't have to have a position of authority to be a leader. In fact, everyone is a leader. Some are better than others. Some don't even realize they're leaders, but they are in their own way. And training doesn't do much good for you. You have little control over opportunities. You have opportunities every day to get leadership. You don't have to be charismatic. I remember the book by Jim Collins, Good to Great, talked about level 5 leadership. And proven to be very effective. Somebody with strong grit and will, but profound humility, and generally they weren't charismatic. And the final myth is everyone can't be a leader, because one, you can, and you can always get better. We're not going to be Winston Churchill, but we can actually be better. I'm not going to be Michael Jordan, but I could go out and practice basketball and get better. And it's the same way with leadership. People say, well, isn't management and leadership really the same thing? I think they're different. They're both vitally important, but they are different. And this is just a contrast at the extremes, I guess, of how you might think about management versus leadership. Managers give directions, and leaders tend to set the direction. Managers tend to direct people, and discover and develop people is more of the leadership role. Control versus inspire, but they're both important. If you're in a burning theater and somebody knows the exits, knows the theater, do you want a manager or do you want a leader? You probably want somebody to give directions, can direct people, and control the operation. Other times, in other situations, you might leadership. So management's tend more intellectual, and leadership tends to be more heart-driven. The other thing about leadership is sort of a paradox, because there's no formula for leadership. You can't write a book and say A, B, C, D, do these three things and you're going to be great, because it's always dependent on the situation. Situational leadership is one of the theories about leadership. Sense of urgency versus patience. Optimism versus caution. Now, every strength, and all of these can be strengths at any given time, but an excess can be a weakness. Remember, I was working at a mortgage company. I was on the management committee, and we weren't allowed to send anything critical or negative in the management committee. So this was positive optimism taken to the extreme. Ultimately, the company failed because they didn't address the issues and the reality that really they were facing. Sorry. So is leadership actually easy? Well, in theory, the models, you can say it's pretty easy. I like these 3 steps that James Clausen has written about. The first is see what needs to be done. Now that seems pretty obvious, but what most people do, they see what they want to do. And sometimes what they want to do and what needs to be done are the same things. Oftentimes it's not the same thing. And what you want to do is all being self-serving and not in the best interest of the group that you're leading, or the group you're surrounding yourself with. And the second point is understand the underlying forces. That could be resource constraints, could be competitors, it could be internal politics, could be the culture. But I can assure you the biggest underlying force is you. And if you don't have great self-insight and self-awareness, this is the one that will trip you up all the time. And then the final step is just take action to make a positive difference. Here's a story of a few years ago, happened in 2006. Lincoln Hall was somebody who had climbed Mount Everest about 5 years earlier, and he came back to do the summit again. And he made the summit again. He was on his way back down, but it got cerebral edema, as they determined later, and just sat down, couldn't move. The Sherpas tried to save him, but they couldn't really move him. And so he was there overnight in the death zone of Mount Everest, as you might have heard of. And then Dan Mazur came along the next morning, and he was a guide, and charged his clients $10,000 a piece. Reached the summit, and he saw Lincoln Hall there, who was still conscious. And so they stopped. They didn't go to the summit. They made every effort to give him their oxygen. They called the team up to try to excavate him, which they did. And he survived. He lost some fingers and some toes to frostbite, but he did survive. And when you think about Dan Mazur, what do you think he wanted to do? He had some people he was leading up there. He charged them $10,000 a piece to go. And don't you think he wanted to go in and go to the summit? Because just a week earlier, David Sharp was a UK climber who was left on the side, and 40 climbers passed him by. He was unconscious and he died on the summit. So those people did what they wanted to do. They went ahead and climbed the mountain. Lincoln Hall saved the man, and or Damazir saved the man and did what needed to be done in that case. So sometimes you got to worry about what you want to do, what needs to be done. So one of his quotes at the end of the story is, "The summit is still there and we can go back, Lincoln Hall. The Lincoln only has one life." Understanding the underlying forces. Boy, I've run into this a lot in my career, and different things can come up. This was when I was working for an offshore drilling company. I left Exxon after 13 years, joined a drilling company. I'd been there, this was in the late 80s. No, it was actually the early 80s. I'd been there about 6 months, and this was before phones and iPhones and everything else. So I got a telex from a superintendent in West Africa. And he said, "We have an ill rig hand and we need to move him to London for medical treatment. And we'd like to charter a plane. I'm asking for your approval to charter a plane." And so I telexed him back and I said, "Well, you must be kidding. I mean, there's a commercial aircraft that will take him to London, and just do that, because chartering a plane would be too costly." And here I was, new in the firm. I said, "I'm here to save money and I can make this decision." And so that's what I told him. Well, the president and chairman is always open to telexes from anywhere around the world. And so the superintendent sent a telex to Bill Kent, who was the president at the time. Well, after about 10 minutes, Bill Kent came into my office and he said, "I understand you didn't approve the chartering of the plane." He said, "Do you realize who puts the money in the bank account, pays your check every month? The rig hands do. I can go out on the street and find you your dime a dozen." And so not only are we going to charter a plane to London, we're going to send his family over there to be with him. So I got the message. I thought I was probably going to be fired, but he was sort of giving me tough love, and I was there another 7 years. But what I didn't understand, the underlying force there was so strong, and I'd only been there a few months, was the culture. The culture was supporting the rig hands out in the field doing work. And that was very, very strong. We built a lot of loyalty among the employees. And so that was a hard lesson, and lucky I didn't get fired that day. This is another one, not understanding the underlying forces. This is late 80s, and the AIDS epidemic was sort of just on the forefront, getting a lot of publicity. Nobody knew too much about it. But, I'm the HR guy, and I thought, well, I want to appear to be cutting edge and on top of everything. So I'm going to promote just a one-page AIDS policy. We'll treat it like any other disease, and it's not contagious, and we'll handle it that way. So I thought, well, I manage committee every Monday morning. So I went in with my one-page policy, and I told them a brief introduction. I had this AIDS policy, and I was going to pass it around. And so I handed out the papers, and the first man to my left picked it up, and he picked it up just by the corner of the paper. It wouldn't even touch the policy. So I imagine you could guess that I didn't get that policy approved. Never did get it approved. But what got in my way, what I wanted to do was appear smart. My ego was too strong. What should I have done? One, I should have reviewed it first as the president. I should have suggested a doctor come in and discuss AIDS with our board, and then we could have discussed whether we needed an AIDS policy. So I didn't understand the underlying forces. I didn't consider it. Again, I was the biggest underlying force that didn't realize that the culture. These are all white men in their 40s, and I should have understood that they might not be receptive to the AIDS policy. So this is a short checklist. You might, when you're thinking about underlying policies, these are things that might come to mind. What everybody wants. What's your self-interest? What are your biases, et cetera, et cetera. And it's just a way to depict it visually. There's driving forces for change, and there's always restraining forces. And you have to understand all of those before you try to make a change or implement something new. And the final act is to make a positive difference. And you can do this every day. It doesn't have to be sophisticated. I like this example. Jeffrey Gitomer, he's a sales guru. He has a newsletter, runs conferences on sales techniques, making you a better salesman. And he tells a story, wrote a column that I recall and I liked. He said every Saturday he'd go to the Ace Hardware store because he wanted to finish up the home projects he couldn't do during the week. He didn't mind going really because the Ace Hardware store had free popcorn. And so he came in and he looked at the popcorn machine, and there was somebody standing at it, and he noticed there was hardly any popcorn left. And he said, surely the man will just leave a little bit for me. But no, he scooped up all the popcorn, put it in a bag, and he went up to the man, and the man asked him, he said, would you like this popcorn? And he couldn't believe that the man was willing to be kind and give that to him. So he wrote a column on it. He followed the guy around the store. He kept thanking him how grateful he was and what a kind actor he was. So every chance you have to have an opportunity to be kind, you should take it because it's actually a form of leadership. The bottom line is you're the biggest underlying force, and you got to remember what you need to do, not what you want to do. Remember, Enron, what they wanted to do was jack up the stock price, so they had some faulty accounting procedures. What they needed to do was be transparent and honest, and they probably would have survived as a company. Self-deception is really easy to have, and this is one way of contrasting how you think you are and how other people perceive you. There are significant differences, and the only way you find that out ultimately is to get feedback from people. Be open to feedback, be transparent, and the right people, the right mentors will give you the proper feedback so you kind of understand the risk of self-deception. The other thing people think, well, I don't have a position of leadership. I'm not in charge of anything. I'm not the executive director. But if you wait to try to exhibit leadership behaviors until you're a leader, according to Clausen at least, it could be too late. The leadership point of view is diversity is important. I like this quote: use the talents you possess. It would be silent if no birds sang it, except those that sang best. Everybody likes to think of this as sometimes as a moral imperative. It's just a powerful business directive, and it makes a huge difference. Some examples: diverse teams are always powerful, more powerful than individual working alone. Yao Ming, the first Asian that really made a splash in at the Houston Rockets and NBA basketball, changed the composition of the crowd. They started selling Chinese beer. More Asians attended. Jackie Robinson, the first black in baseball, changed the nature of the game. Talented black players got into Major League Baseball. The crowds changed. There were blacks buying tickets and coming to the games. Banking, I remember when we moved here in '68, most of the banking didn't have bilingual tellers. And so the Hispanics that were in town tended to do their work, their banking work in Mexico, and then send the money to Mexico. Well, somebody finally decided, if we're serving a large portion of Hispanics, we better have some bilingual tellers. And then people slowly moved a bit more banking in Houston rather than sending the money to Mexico. I've done a lot of survival exercises. Maybe you've participated in some. During your time in the workforce, it's desert survival, moon survival. You get a list of 15 things that would be essential to surviving the situation you're in. You're supposed to rank them in priority order, most important or least important. Everybody does it individually, and then the group gets together and discusses it. And 9 times out of 10, no individual ever comes up with the best answer as determined by survival experts, as the team does. So teams are very powerful. They add to creativity, and diversity is powerful for the same reason. And of course, women in the workforce were denied positions for years and years, and we're just not allowing half our workforce to be productive in all the roles that are available now to them. It's made a huge difference. Everybody is perfect for something, and of course, one of the jobs of leaders is to put people in positions they're best at, and or coaching them in their strengths so they can become even better at what they're best at. This is you complain your tree is not valuable because it's twisted, it's broken, maybe it's misshapen. But the point of this Zen master was you can use the shade, rest under its branches, admire its character, and so forth. Its only use is because you want to make it into something else and do not use it in its proper way. Well, all people have to be used in their proper way to be addressed to their strength, and makes a difference. So if we saw souls instead of faces, how different our ideals of beauty would be. Which is true. Ram Dass is kind of a favorite philosopher, but he's passed now. But he says when you go into a forest, you admire the trees in all different sizes and shapes, and some are bent to get to the sun. But you just appreciate them the way they are. You don't try to make them into something else. You don't judge them. They're just trees in a forest, and they're all beautiful. So one thing that let's see if he looks at people and he imagines them as trees, so he won't judge them. I think one technique that I do sometimes is I imagine people when they were babies, because they were perfect and lovable and innocent and sweet. And everybody was at one time. And this is true too. The more you know about yourself, and again, this is self-awareness, self-insight, absolutely critical to leadership, the more patience you have what you see in others. Until you know all of you, including your dark side, you won't really understand yourself. So feedback's important. The other thing that makes us influence how we feel about people is context. There's a great story about Ronnie Goodman. He's homeless in San Francisco, but he does painting in a halfway house kind of place. But he runs every day, 2 hours a day. And so he puts all his running gear, and when he's seen on the street, he just says, I'm just another runner, not a bum on the street. So he escapes the judgment of being a bum because he's running. And so you can see that the context makes a big difference in how you view people. Now, I used to have a stereotype about obese people, and I knew it. One part I was self-aware, and I remember we had a lawyer come in. We were hiring somebody for our legal team, and he was quite overweight, and so I had to put that aside and interview him. We ended up hiring him. He's one of the best attorneys we had in the department. So if you have these stereotypes or blind spots, it can affect your role as a leader, and you're going to miss out on some valuable talent. The other thing is I found the most powerful. I taught leadership and business ethics for quite a few years, and I told the class they'd forget me, they'd forget the textbook, they'd forget all the PowerPoints, they'd forget the guest speakers. I only wanted them to remember one thing, and that was the power of gratitude. And a lot of leaders miss that and don't use it. So I used to have my students, I'd recommend you to do the same thing. Write a personal note of gratitude to somebody you appreciate in your life. And then I'd have them come back and they'd report on it. And there was some very emotional responses from some of the people that they wrote most of, some of their wives who ended up crying. And gratitude is just extremely important. And it's a way to demonstrate leadership as well. Another interesting experiment that shows something about what you could do and should do as a leader is the Hawthorne experiment. Some of you probably heard about it. There was in 1924, a long time ago, a Western Electric plant for assembling phones. They wanted to see if changes in the workplace could incent to better productivity. And so they set aside a group and they changed their working hours. They changed the amount of breaks they had. They changed the time for their lunch. In fact, they included so many breaks that the team finally said, you're interrupting our work. We have too many breaks. And each time they changed things, the productivity went up. And then they stopped doing anything, and their productive capacity went up even further. So it was an interesting experiment. And so what did they learn? This is a team who worked together, was isolated, especially to be observed. And they worked for more than economic self-interest, because it was the attention from the management and the leadership that they were getting, and the feedback that was important. So empowerment, which they had more empowerment because they had some control of the physical conditions in which they worked, was powerful. There's an old story, and a pretty old story, because this assembly line was building a transistor radios, and they wanted to increase the productivity of the transistor radios. And most of the workers on the transistor radio assembly line were women who were working a second job, to help the income of the family. And so the management decided, well, I think we should pay them on a per unit basis that meets the quality standard. And so they did that, and productivity didn't go up. And so the HR person, I like to credit the HR person for doing this, went down to the team of people doing the transistor radio production and said, what bothers you most about this job? And they said, well, our kids get home from school at 3, and so what bothers us is we can't be home right away when the kids are there because we're still working. So they decided to put in, when you're done with your quota for the day, you can go home. And of course, the quota was set higher than normal productivity rate. And of course, they meet that so they can get out by 3 o'clock. It's kind of like watching the garbage people run. I think they run because when they're done with the route, they get to go home. So here's a case where they listened to the people, they paid attention to them, they asked what they needed to be more effective, and they implemented those answers. It wasn't somebody who read a book and thought, gee, paying by the piece rate would really make a difference. So this is all about empowering people, developing people. There's 3 ways to do it. You can tell people what to do and how to do it, or you can do it yourself because it's easier than showing someone how. Risk of mistakes is seems too great. Or you can be a partner with people, empower people, so they approach the job the best and get what they want and hold the team accountable. I was a little bit of a micromanager, fairly well mid-career actually. It happened, and I was a real stickler about memos. Of course, those are the days you didn't have emails or anything; you just wrote memos. So if it was a fairly routine memo, I'd have the secretary draft me a memo with such and such, and she would draft the memo and bring it to me. And of course, I was nitpicking about memos and how she should be worded and so forth. So I'd change it. Sometimes not too much, sometimes fairly significantly, and I'd hand it back to her to retype it. So one day I decided, it's not giving her much credit for doing the job that she should be doing. So the next time she gave me a memo, she drafted it. I said, I signed it. I said, that's fine, send it out. And she said, really? You're not going to review it? You're not going to change it? No, I think it's fine. So she went back and she redrafted it herself to be the best job that she could do and sent it back to me, and I signed it. And from then on, she did the memos, but she knew what the expectation was. So that was developing people. I wasn't controlling them. I wasn't trying to do everything myself. Here's an interesting thing about whether you're going to control people and manage them, micromanage them, or you're going to let them develop and learn on their own through their own experience. I was one of my, well, actually it was my first job. It was a defense contractor, and I was a shift engineer for propellant processing. We were building the second stage of Minuteman missiles, defense missiles, and I was in charge of the ships 4 to 11 for mixing the propellant and getting cast into the motors, the Minuteman motors. So one evening, shortly after my shift started, it was probably around 6 o'clock, one of the mix stations, which was managing about 2,000 pounds of solid propellant, blew up. And they were in a contained building, but it looked like, I looked over there and it was, like a rocket going to China, because all the flames are coming up. And I thought, oh my gosh, what a disaster. So Frank Robinson was my supervisor from the day shift. And so I called Frank. I said, Frank, we had a major catastrophe out here. The mix station 3 blew up. Luckily, nobody was hurt. But a lot of damage to the mix station because they were all in the control room, so they weren't hurt. And Frank said, Doug, what's your job out there? I said, well, Frank, I'm a propellant engineer on the swing shift. He said, do you get paid every 2 weeks? said, sure, Frank, and I appreciate it. That's great. He said, well, then do your job, write up the incident, put it on my desk. We'll discuss it when you get in at 4 o'clock tonight. Now, I worked for people who, if this happened, they would have been in their car, out there immediately, taken over, and probably criticized me for not doing more to maybe prevent it. I don't know. But that's a valuable lesson, because I think taking initiative is largely determined by your first supervisors. And unless it's a career ending or organization damaging thing, you should let people do it and figure it out for themselves, which is, I always appreciate Frank for doing that. And the final thing, not one of the final things that I think you should consider using in your own organization. I don't know if you have performance appraisal systems, you write up forms every year or every 6 months. You're trying to identify the weak people. You might have to make a termination decision, so you need a paper trail for that. And it's very judgmental. It's a one-way, one-time usually report. I think much preferable is performance coaching, which is different than performance appraisal, and it's being a coach, not a judge. And again, every strength and excess is a weakness, so you have to be careful about doing too much control. There's just some examples, and when you get this later, you can think about these and think how you handle people that work with you, either your team or report to you. There's a lot of judgmental questions, and it's also a multiply long list. Are you finished yet? Versus, what's the status of the project? Do you have a problem? Can I help you with that? That's clear, isn't it? Do you have any questions? You see the drift of the tone, the difference? I was coaching one CEO, and he got so enthralled with this that he put these questions, he laminated them. He kept them at his desk. So it would remind him that you need to be a coach, not a judge. So, that's more coaching questions. There's also an infinite number. How can I help? So starting next week, you will do what? Tell me more about that. Is your behavior getting you what you want? So these are some open-ended questions to get people to be vulnerable, and you're there to help them. You're not there to judge them and criticize them. And when I was young, a teenager, I used to like to raise tropical fish. And the fish guy loved me in the fish store because most of my fish didn't live very long. So I was always going back to buy new fish. And the other thing the salesman at the fish store wanted to do, he kept telling me, Doug, he said, you got this little 5-gallon tank. That's just not right for your fish. They're not going to grow. So he finally talked me into, I think I got up to a 25 or 50-gallon tank. And sure enough, the fish did better. They grew more. And it's the same in the business. You have to make your fish tank big. You have to get people empowered to do things and make decisions. I remember the old Nordstrom, I don't know if it was a myth or not. It said the policy was use your best judgment in all situations. And the customer is number one. And there's no other rules. That's a pretty big fish tank. Not many people would do that because they think there's too much risk in it. But it's healthy for an organization, typically, if you have people that can make good judgment, of course. And I love this survey done by Gallup a long time ago now. I still think it's very appropriate and works. But they sent out to 50 to 100 companies a list of maybe 100 questions. And they were trying to correlate the results of the answers to these questions with customer service, financial success, and a couple others that I don't recall right now. And the ones that correlated best with the success of the company were these 12 questions. And I think if you can answer yes to all these questions for your workforce, for you personally, you're probably going to be pretty engaged, and you're going to be more effective, and you're going to be more motivated. I know what is expected of me at work. I have materials I need to do the work right. I can do what I do best every day. There's someone at work who encourages my development. Again, coaching. My opinions seem to count. Ask people what they think. And the one that always surprised me the most is I have a best friend at work. And this gives me question about one, because of diversity, power of teams and so forth. The virtual workplace, working from home for everybody, I'm really not a fan of it. Of course, I'm old school. We always went in the office. But I think there's a lot of power in the social interactions at work, the teamwork, the creativity, and it works as social activity. So that's important. And opportunities to grow and people talk to me about my progress. So if people aren't encouraged and engaged, you won't do as well as you could do otherwise. So those are questions you can review with yourself, your staff, and see if you're meeting the criteria. So one of my challenges, in addition to writing a personal vote of gratitude to somebody that makes a difference in your life, pick an issue. You want to see somebody improve or your team to improve, and practice meeting with them, talking to them about it, and require some accountability so they know what they're expected to achieve. It's kind of like a no excuses environment. If you're the leader and you tell people that if there's something you need, you're not getting from me a resource required, and you don't ask me, then there's no excuses. So we got a no excuse environment. You come to say what you need and what you want, and we're going to be accountable for what you've committed to do. I like Steve Jobs because this is kind of the concept of empowerment. The best ideas have to win, not the control structure, not the hierarchy, not the chairman. Wherever the best ideas are, they have to be encouraged, they have to bubble up, and we have to make some assessment of those ideas, and the best ideas should win. Research found that direct reports of managers who check in on progress toward weekly goals are up 24 times more likely to achieve them. And this is kind of Tom Peters' managing search of excellence, managed by working around. Unfortunately, with a virtual workforce and everybody working from home, this is harder to do. And I think it's potentially an issue that could affect productivity. Now, some productivity is probably improved by working from home because you eliminate the commute, you have more quiet time to work. That's possible, but I think being seen is important, important for all leaders. Trust but verify. This empowerment sounds great, but if you empower people that aren't equipped for the job, you get bad decisions faster. So you got to have quality staff. But I was with a nonprofit, and I found out that you have to ask tough questions, because lots of times nonprofits are, well, everybody's feeling good about each other. They trust each other because you're doing good for the community and humanity. And so there's a lot of trust, but there's a lot of corruption that exists in some nonprofits. And so we weren't asking the tough questions, and then later found out that designated funds were being used for general operating costs. So yes, with respect, but you have to ask the tough questions. And we all have good intentions, and we know where that page goes to, but you can't, as Henry Ford said, you can't build a reputation of what you're going to do. You have to take action and do things. Now, corporate brand promises. Now, your nonprofit, or wherever you work, probably has a brand promise. And of course, these are some famous corporations that have brand promises. Coca-Cola, it used to be, it's the real thing, and they changed it to real magic. I like the real thing better. But you remember when they brought out the new Coke? Some of you may be too young to remember that. And there was a tremendous backlash for new Coke. And they said, you told us you had the real thing, and now you brought out something new. So they had to go back and have Coke Classic. So they violated the brand promise in some ways. Lexus, Experience Amazing, used to be the pursuit of perfection. I actually like that better too. BMW, that's been around a long time, the open driving machine. FedEx, the world on time. It used to be when you absolutely positively have to get something there overnight. Well, what if FedEx only got it there 95% of the time overnight? They've broken their brand promise, and they would suffer tremendously. So you've probably got a tagline for your organization, what's your brand promise, and make sure that you're able to execute on your brand promise. It's important. The other thing, besides your brand promise, maybe each of you have value statements. If you don't, I think you should write down your value statement. And this is an example. Let's say your value statement is risk-taking, respect, innovation, clients number one, trust, take responsibility. Well, if you're going to reward risk-taking, you have to forgive mistakes, because you can't ever, without any failure, you probably not tried anything. Respect, zero tolerance for disrespect. So you have to be sure that your behaviors follow your organizational values. Sometimes they do, a lot of times they don't. And as a leader, you have to have your own brand promise. So I would encourage everybody to write down what their values are, and then that's what you can be guaranteed to do. Verizon years ago, they had a strike, and it was over this issue. The core values were integrity, respect, imagination, passion, and service. But all their customer service representatives had scripted responses. And they said, you say respect, you're not respecting us to do the right thing, and imagination and passion. So they had an extremely small fish tank because they were scripted on what to do. And they actually had a strike over that issue. So core values, the behaviors have to match the values. And of course, integrity, that's critical for all values. If you have integrity, nothing else matters. If you don't have integrity, nothing else matters. David Thomas used to speak on integrity. I wasn't very good at listening early in my career, and then I found out the value of listening is tremendous. And listening rather than lecturing, really. And lots of managers and leaders like to lecture rather than listen. And speaking from the heart. Speaking from the heart requires you to be vulnerable, transparent, admit your weaknesses, or at least the things you're not confident with. Because if people don't know where you're troubled or where you're having issues, they can't help you. So being transparent and maybe even asking for help makes a huge difference. So you have to listen really well to what other people are saying to help them, and you have to be quite transparent in what you speak. Managed agreement. A lot of these courses you may go to, you're going to find out, well, we've got a session on managing conflict. And there's a lot of work done on how to manage conflict. I think the harder thing to do is manage an agreement. Have you ever been into a conference room or a team meeting, and the leader will come in and say, this is what I think about this issue, and state the position? Well, everybody in the room, since they work with this person, is going to tend to agree with that position. The better approach is go in and present the issue, the problem, the opportunity, and ask everybody to contribute what they think about it. And then at the end, the leader can offer their opinion on how they think it should be handled, or at least taking ideas from the others. What can happen is everybody will agree in the room if it's not handled that way, and then everybody walks out and they're mumbling, they're talking to their colleague and saying, can you believe that we're just decided to do this and do that? So if you get full agreement in a room and get it very quickly, be very suspect of that and start asking a lot of questions. And particularly people that you think are reserved or haven't said much during the meeting, ask a lot of questions, be open to the answers. So managing agreement can be difficult if you don't do it, because you're going to end up with some bad decisions. So you kind of go, maybe you're wondering, well, how am I doing as a leader? And as Larry Bossidy, used to be CEO of Allied Signal company long ago, he said, when confused as to how you're doing as a leader, find out how the people you lead are doing. You'll know the answer. Because your role is to develop other people to make better leaders of everybody else. Hire people that are better than you in areas you might be weak. When they're doing well, you know you're going to be doing well. Here's another model, kind of a simplistic thing. It says you need vision, skills, incentives, resources, and plans. If you don't have vision, there might be a lot of confusion. If you don't have the skills, there'll be anxiety. If you don't have incentives, you may have gradual change, but not as fast as you like. If you don't have resources, you'll be frustrated. If you don't have an action plan, you may have a lot of false starts. This is another way of thinking about getting things done. And all those things typically have to be in place for you to be successful. The one thing that leaders have to manage and manage well is their time. And every CEO I've ever worked for, they have a strong sense of urgency and they manage their time extremely well. I remember going into one CEO and we had a training plan we wanted to present, and I had the training manager with me and said, Bill, we need about 30 minutes of your time. And he said, well, you've got 20 minutes to talk fast. You've got to have a sense of urgency, manage your calendar extremely well, only do key priorities, delegate everything else. If something has low value to you or an organization, then say no. And you got to leverage your resources. We used to have managers, I was the HR guy, and so some of them wanted to avoid us because they thought we'd say no to something because it wasn't in the policy manual. That isn't the way I operate. But some would think that. The most effective leaders would call on the HR department to help them solve an issue. And they were the most effective because all the resources in the company they would tap. And always remember to use the resources available. And an interesting exercise for you to do sometime is you have an issue or problem, ask somebody who you would never think to ask about it and see what their opinion is. Sometimes you're going to be surprised about the ideas or things they bring up that you had no idea of before you asked. But of course, if you have leadership, you've got to have strategy. And I assume that your nonprofit has plans and strategy. So many areas you have to have strategy around. These are some of them. And it's not easy to do, but strategy is important. Otherwise, you probably be a little aimless in where you're going. Making a positive difference. You know, that's the last step. And you're in noble work. You're doing business that helps people. And it doesn't matter what you're doing. If it's helping people and making a difference in the community and humanity, you're doing good work. You're making a positive difference. So keep it up. I congratulate you for that. So in summary, we got this done a little less than an hour. Experience is the best teacher. Self-insight, absolutely critical. Work on it if you don't have it. Ask people you trust to give you feedback. The simple model: see, understand, and act. Management and leadership are different, both critical and important. Gratitude is, you can't imagine how powerful it is if you use it more. Listen more, ask questions to manage agreement, practice humility, be persistent. Love and respect, create trust and loyalty. Everybody has unique gifts. Coach, don't judge. Imagine people as trees. Know your brand, be transparent, live your brand. Create more leaders using trust, appreciation, and empowerment. Everybody can be better. Like I said, you're not going to be Winston Churchill. We're not going to be Ronald Reagan or some other great leader in the world, but we can be better. And that comes from experience. That comes from the failures, the mistakes. They all teach you something. I've made many, many mistakes and hopefully learned a lot about them. Everyone wants to hear three things. I love you. I forgive you. I'm grateful you're in my life. Doesn't sound like a corporate mantra, but it is. And if you keep those things in mind, you're going to go a long ways. Next time you go into a conference room, before you get in there, think to yourself, I love everybody in this room. You don't have to like them, but you need to love them. You're grateful. Send people notes. Jack Welch of GE used to spend every day writing a few personal notes of thanks to some people in his organization. Extremely powerful. It's the only thing I wanted my students to remember. Remember the power of gratitude. And some people have gotten back to me and said, you know, this really works. So that's it. I didn't get any questions, I guess. If you have any now, you can ask them. This is my contact information. By the way, that picture is about 10 years old, but hopefully you still recognize me. That's my email, my cell phone. You can call if you want me to come to your organization personally for anything or address any issues you have. I'd be happy to help to the extent that I can. So that's it for today. And if you have any last minute questions or thoughts or feedback, I'd appreciate that.
Will we be able to receive the slides and recordings later?
Yes, I assume so. Lady, do you have, are you on? Maybe she's off right now. Yes, she said she would be sending those.
Okay, thank
You
you.
might just request it, just to be sure. If you want to use it in your own organization, for you personally, that's fine. We prefer we didn't use it recorded with other groups. But that's fine. But I'm here to be available for anything you think I might be.
I don't plan to use it with a group. I just plan to use it for myself.
Well, either one, you can use it with your group. That's fine.
Mhm.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you asking for it. Hopefully there'll be some information in here that you can experiment with, try out. Again, this doesn't make you a better leader. Only trying the things you think have some significance or meaning for you, that might make a difference. All right. If there's no other questions, I guess we'll sign off, and all the best to everybody.
I just have a question, I guess, for the group. I know a lot of us work for local nonprofits. Is there any way, if anyone's willing just to drop your email and your name in the chat if you ever need a network or anything?
I'm trying to hearing you. The volume is so low.
Oh, sorry. Is that better?
Much better.
Oh, perfect. So I know a lot of us work for local nonprofits. Instead I'm from Amana. So if there's any way, I'll drop my information in the chat. I don't know if anybody else wanted to do the same in case, there's networking opportunity there later.
Oh, sure. Hopefully there will be some. Or you might, Lady Alvarado, who's the kind of executive assistant for Executive Service Corps, you can ask her if she could circulate something about networking.
Perfect. That would work.
I think that's a great idea. I'll drop my information in the chat as well.
Okay. Very good. Well, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you, everybody. And I will be sending this recording and the slides to you all a bit after. Right. Thank you. Thank you, Douglas.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.